Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Promo Code Ham YouTube channel. I'm Guy.
I'm John.
Subscribe to the channel right down there.
Also, subscribe to our podcast. This is the YouTube. Our podcast, Haberman, that's him. Middlecoff, that's me. Link is down there in the description. Had a podcast for a long time. Subscribe. You'll love it.
Today, we're ranking SEC football coaches. Not easy. This is a hell of a group.
Star-studded. A lot of national championships, Guy. A lot of money and a lot of percentages of their salaries going Jimmy Sexton's way.
That's right. That's a good point. Jimmy's running the SEC.
Yeah, don't get it twisted.
So we decided to look at this way. If you're starting a program from scratch right now, who you going with? That's how we're ranking this. Pretty simple. And I don't know that we need to spend much time at number one. This is not shocking anybody.
Nick Saban?
Yeah, okay, Saban.
Yeah, I mean, you could make an argument that it's the greatest run in the history of college football, and really the role he's played in the conference, right? I mean, he also won a national championship at LSU. He took Alabama and made them, I mean, probably the closest thing we've seen in college sports to the John Wooden UCLA dynasty in football, right? Over the past 12 years, really since, 08, 09, once he got that thing going. I'll never forget when, you and me, Fresno State guys, he hires Jim McElwain. Jim McElwain's first recruit, the first assignment he had when he was hired as the offensive coordinator was to go visit Julio Jones, who was, one of the biggest recruits probably the last 15, 20 years, turned into a star. And the Alabama's really never looked back. Even in some of their down seasons, they don't have 6-6 years, right? It usually takes injuries, takes miracles to beat them. Think of their probably a top 5 most famous game. You could argue top 2 or 3 is a loss in the kick six. And that's what it took to beat them, guy. A kick freaking six.
Right.
It's one of the most historic games. And in all the national championships, you think about the upset loss he had to Urban Meyer in the college football playoffs when Cardale Jones, remember, no one really knew who he was, but Saban's, I mean, I think he's the GOAT.
6 natties, 7 straight division titles, 3 of the last 4 SEC champs, 8. To me, like we'll talk about Jimbo 7-2 in bowl games. Saban is 6-3 in CFP games. 6-3, like that's a good just bowl record. That's his college football playoff record. It's just stupid.
Could you rename the first round of the NFL draft Nick Saban? Doesn't it feel like for the past decade he's got?
I think you could rename the national championship trophy.
Yeah.
After he retires.
My point is, I mean, the first round of the last decade has been littered with 5 to 7 Alabama players every single draft.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, you have 3 picks in the top 10.
But I think
like
you
Alabama.
could actually, but that's like a real thing you could do is make it the Saban trophy.
That you could, yeah.
All right, number 2. This is where we had some disagreement. We agreed these two were 2 or 3, and just so you know, we each made our own list, then we came together. We were able to agree on everything else except for number 2, Jimbo and Eddie O. I went with the old Eddie O photo. I mean, you got to go with the mullet photo.
Yeah.
This was what's interesting about these guys at number 2, this is gonna be, if the year happens, a massive year for both of them. We might come after this year happens, John. We potentially would have an agreement on where these two are, and they potentially, one of them who's not number 2 could end up number 4 after this season, number 5.
Yeah, I mean, this one is tough for me because last year, you can't take last year away from Ed Orgeron's resume. It's arguably, in a vacuum, the greatest college football season we've ever seen. And he plays a huge role in that because he's probably viewed as a top 2 or 3 recruiter over his 20 plus years of playing a huge role in college football, right? So all the guys on the squad, he's recruiting. And he's also a good coach recruiter. He played a big role in bringing Joe Brady. Now, he loses coaches because these guys go on to run their own program. Joe Brady's gone. Joe Burrow's gone. The one thing about LSU, right, they bring in sweet players just like Alabama. My question would be moving forward, why I went with Jimbo and you went with Ed. I would lean Jimbo at 2, but I can live with Ed. I know that Jimbo never has to worry, kind of like in the NFL. Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, Doug Peterson, Andy Reid, they are the offensive coordinator. They're the ones calling the plays.
Right.
So if coaches leave, no matter what, at the end of the day, Nick Saban, he's not the defensive coordinator, but if he's got to, push comes to shove, Nick Saban can call the defense. Ed Orgeron can't. That's not his deal. Jimbo Fisher calls the offense. And when he won a national championship, he was the play caller. He was the guy telling Jameis Winston what to do. When they made it to the college football playoffs, he's the guy telling Jameis Winston what to do the following year. This year was going to be a huge year for him. I think when you look at the schedule, there's a chance that he'd be 10-0 going into his final 2 games at Bama.
You're talking about
and
Jimbo.
Talking about Jimbo,
Yeah.
Ed Orgeron, against LSU, the final game. For Ed, this year, to me, if he could win 9 or 10 games, losing his offensive coordinator, his defensive coordinator, the greatest quarterback in the history of the program, it would be really, really impressive. So I think this is a huge swing year for these two guys. I don't think you can go wrong. Jimbo's been doing it long. Jimbo's 132 as a head coach. Now, you can counter, and it's fair.
Wait, say that again. He's 132. 100 wins, 32 losses.
As a head coach. Yeah. Nick Saban called him the greatest offensive coordinator that's ever worked for him.
Yeah, look. So the reason I have Ed, Coach O, ahead of Jimbo is just that his prolific success is coming more recently than Jimbo's, and Jimbo's is prolific, right? But it was 12, 13, 14 in that stretch in the ACC, which he won a national championship. He went 39-3, 23-1 in the league. And you're right. This would be the year, because of his schedule, the opportunity to make that run, to put it all together. For Ed, though, it's not like last year at 15-0 came – I know it was treated like a major surprise, but it'd been a steady build. They won 6 games. They won 9 games. They won 10 games in his first 3 years at LSU, and then he breaks the bank and wins 15. And we're talking about starting a program. So while you do lean with guys who can, if they have to, call plays, the beauty is I'm starting a program at a big school. If Dave Aranda leaves, we'll just go get Bo Pelini, which is what LSU did. I'll just pay a lot of money to my next offensive coordinator. And the one thing that Eddie does, and you know he does this, is he's an incredible recruiter, maybe the best. So I do know I've got a head coach with a 1A premium skill, leading and recruiting. And don't forget, at SC, when he went 6-2, took over for Lane that year, they beat Stanford, who was ranked 5th in the nation at the time, and would go on to the Rose Bowl. So you're right. I mean, the long-term kind of history of Jimbo is bigger. I just think Eddie's premium years are right now. And the question is, can Jimbo get back to 12, 13, 14 here in 20, 21, 22? Which is, I mean, like you said, they're paying him a lot of money to do it. That's why I lean Ed.
To me, I can't knock Jimbo for kicking the shit out of all the ACC teams, because we don't do that with Dabo right now, right?
No, I mean, we'll go through this list. The guys who aren't in this league, or even the guys that are, I think, John, one of the best ways to judge a coach, what does he do against his league, and what is he doing versus the history of the program where he's coaching, right?
Because Jimbo now has been there 2 years, and he's 9-7 in the ACC. And I'm putting a lot of stock on this in the SEC. I'm putting a lot of stock on his team this year, who he's talked openly about at the end of the season. They played a bunch of freshmen. They have a bunch of red shirts. They're going to have a young team. I think the SEC West, Bama's going to be in a huge transition year. LSU, huge transition year. Ole Miss, Mississippi State, new coaches. It's an opportunity for him. That 9-7 record, if he, let's just say, again, hypothetically, 7-1, boom, you're talking 16-8 right away. He's representing the West. Now, if he goes 5-3 or 4-4 again, then yeah, I have no problem doing Ed, because Ed did it now, in the SEC.
The argument for, right, they play Alabama at home this year. Alabama, LSU, excuse me. They go to Florida. They go to Auburn. They don't play Georgia this year. Rolling back 11 wins would be a little bit difficult, but
for LSU.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if Ed Orgeron went 9-3, I'd tip my hat to him. 2 new coordinators, losing some multiple stars, not just on offense guy. You have the middle linebacker, you have safety, you got defensive players you're going to lose. That it's a big deal for LSU. Now, like Bama, you lose Patrick Queen, you got another dude coming up the pipe. You lose Joe Brady. It's harder actually for quarterbacks. Like, they're going to lose Jefferson. Well, they still have Chase. and they recruit at an elite level.
Right.
All these teams do that we're talking about at the top do. So like some programs, like when you talk about Ole Miss or Mississippi State or the Vandies, they don't have the margin for error, losing first round picks. Where historically LSU, Alabama, Florida, when they're running or when they're humming, it's easier for them to just like boom, another double-digit win season.
We kicked around whether or not Dan Mullen could be 2 or 3. We've got him 4 at Florida. And you would argue this is a big year for him. Like historically, year 3 has been big years for Florida coaches in the past, guys that have started fast, like he started. Ultimately, we have to take into account his Mississippi State time, and that works in his favor here. This is where you go into what have you done relative to the history of your program. Obviously, Florida's been great, but the big picture with Mullen, Mississippi State has been to 23 bowl games, John. That's not a lot. Mullen led him to 7. 5-2 in bowl game. I don't care so much about your bowl record. It's just, did you get what did you do? So 7 of the 23 bowl appearances for Mississippi State was Mullen, more than any other coach in the history of the program. Then he gets to Florida, loses his quarterback this year, and has a great year.
Yeah, to me, Dan Mullen, like Jimbo Fisher, have an opportunity in 2020 to be in the SEC championship game. And to me, that can swing their power in the conference. Now, Mullen has been in the conference for a long period of time, right? He was the coordinator with Urban Meyer, kicking the crap out of everyone at Florida with the Tebow teams. What he did at Mississippi State, almost underrated at this point, because he's not just winning. The team he had, Dak Prescott, remember, they got up to number 1 in the country. Now, it was for a short period of time, but think of the NFL players guy that came out of that program on his watch. Dak Prescott's the most famous one because he's the quarterback, but Fletcher Cox, Darius Slay. I mean, Mississippi State really started producing some high-end NFL talent. And then at Florida, I understand that he hasn't had, quote-unquote, like, he hasn't been in the SEC championship game in 2 years, but he's 21-5. He's 21-5 in 2 years, where that program had fallen on hard times. You watch the Hard Knocks with him. To me, he's unlike, Saban or Eddie, this huge personality. He's got a little more of an NFL feel to him, a little more nuts and bolts, and just an elite scheme guy. I think this guy has a chance that if Saban retires, and he just can really maximize Florida to win a national championship there, right? If I told you in the next 5 years he wins a national championship in Florida, I think it's very believable.
Not shocking. I think what I'm waiting for is 2021. He has not played Saban, and he will not play Saban this year since he went to Florida. Obviously, he played Saban at Alabama, never beat him. I went back looking through Mississippi State, or when he was at Mississippi State, hoping to find, did he have a game where they almost got him? In the Dak year in 2014, they lost by 5, but I went back and watched like the 5-minute highlights. It wasn't really as close as the final score. So I'm looking forward to Mullen, full deck, 2021, year 4 at Florida, and Saban.
In fairness to him, if Alabama is humming, Mississippi State should never beat them, right?
Yeah. It's not a knock that he didn't. I was just hoping maybe he got him one time, and then
I think
because I started this process wanting to put kind of like my bias was I want to put Mullen at 2, and I couldn't do it.
If I viewed the guy we're going to talk about next, if you had to bet on one of the 2 top guys in the SEC East, and you had to put $1,000 like a stock, which one of these 2 guys is going to win the national championship? I think this is why we ranked it the way we did. We would both put our money on Dan Mullen. We would not put it on Kirby. Now, Kirby has one thing. When Mark Richt was there, you'd flip them on, and they always 2 years later would have there's like 17 NFL guys on that team. How'd they not win the national championship? And Kirby's kind of had that going these last couple of years, right? Stacked rosters. And you could argue a couple years ago, he was right there to win the entire thing. And so far in big games up against Nick, which it's hard to crush a guy for losing a game against Nick Saban, but he had him on the ropes. He had him on the ropes, and he couldn't get it done. Because if he had gotten that done and won the national championship, I don't think there's any way that Kirby Smart is not at 2 on this list, right? If he had won a national championship a couple years ago at Georgia when they were up at halftime.
Yep.
They were up at halftime, guys.
Because everything else on paper, 21-3 in the league the last 3 years, 25-7 in the last 4. SEC Coach in the Year, had the #1 scoring defense in the nation last year. LSU scored 4 touchdowns against them. I think LSU scored 37 points against them. But you know how many teams held LSU to less than 4 touchdowns in a game? 1. Auburn held them to 3. That's it. And then one other team held them to 4. So even against that prolific offense relative to what everybody else did, he held them, I don't want to say relatively in check. He did a good job. They were great on defense. But that's not what we're not talking about wins. We're not talking about is your defense good, right? We're talking about the bar has been raised to can you win a national championship? I think he can. I do think he can. But the big game is probably what leaves you wanting a little more.
Well, what I think they're going to be kicking themselves is a guy like Roquan Smith is going to go on to be an NFL star. I mean, he got hurt last year, but I think he's going to be a great NFL player. Nick Chubb has established himself as one of the best running backs in the league. Sony Michel was drafted ahead of Nick Chubb, and I know he had a up and down year his second year, but he plays for Belichick. I think he's going to be a stud. They had premium guys. They've had kind of like an Alabama-like roster these last several years, and especially on that team, and they couldn't get it done. So you go, well, when Nick has all the blue chippers and he's in position, he gets it done. You could question, like, is Kirby good enough to just get him over that hump? And you could argue he's still relatively young. He stayed with Nick for a long period of time, right, when he could have taken other jobs. I think he's shown Georgia, what would you say, to be a top 6 or 7 job in the country? I mean, it's an elite job. My buddies that scout in the SEC said that Georgia these last 2 or 3 years, and he's taken advantage of this, has just had an ideal recruiting class. Like some of the top recruits in the country have come from that state, and he's crushed it. Like he is in his sweet spot right now. The thing you would say, though, is he's had a lot of quarterback turnover in like a 2-year span. He had Eason was the top guy, then he was forced to transfer. Fromm played it out, and you would go, well, he was the least talented of the bunch, but he won a bunch of games, but he wasn't quite good enough to get him over the hump. And then the blue chip guy somehow is now at Ohio State, and it looks like he might be the #1 overall pick in the draft, or potentially. We'll see him and Trevor Lawrence. But I don't think it's crazy right now if I told you that Justin Fields, when the dust settles, beats out Trevor Lawrence as the top guy. A little unlikely right now, but not improbable.
Yeah, the question is, will their offense just be good enough with the transfer Jamie Newman from Wake Forest that Georgia fans every week aren't checking Justin Fields' box score? Like that, he's not going to be as good as Justin Fields, but is he good enough that you're like, as a collective, he gives us the offense that we need to have a chance to win it all?
Well, I think you're kicking yourself is if Florida gets you, right? And Florida wins the SEC East.
Yeah.
Because your quarterback's not good enough.
All right, we talked about that. You and I went back and forth. We've got Gus Malzahn at number 6. I had him, I think it's 7 or 8 initially. After talking, you talked me into 6. So I'll let you start on Gus. Why do you have to have him ahead of everybody else on this list?
Well, he's 71 at 34. It's a very, very, very tough job when you factor in Alabama in his tenure has been in the peak of their powers. And he's the second program in the state, even though it's a powerhouse national program. But he has won a lot of big games, guy. Just look last season. He beat Oregon to open up the season, who turned out when all the dust settled at last year's football season in 2019, Oregon was a top 4 or 5 team in the country. And he went toe-to-toe with a freshman quarterback.
Right.
And then I know the guy missed a field goal by hitting the goalpost or the upright, but he did beat Nick Saban, and he's beat him several times now. Like you beat Nick Saban in a game that is their Duke, North Carolina, is their Ohio State, Michigan. I mean, they would say that is the game in Alabama. Like, no, those games are our version of the Iron Bowl. That is life.
Yep.
And he's won that game. Now, his bowl record's 2-5. I think sometimes when you judge bowl games, when you lose to Alabama in their position, and they've been in position to go to the SEC championship game, I give them some leeway of not taking bowls as seriously, because when I watch them against Alabama, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, these last half decade, I never feel like they don't belong, at least for a period of time, even when they don't win the game. Now, he's probably been the #1 coach that feels like he's going to get fired every year, but always like, oh, he beat LSU, he's safe.
Yeah, and part of it, right, is the nature of being at a high-pressure job. Like, to me, he is where he is based on the fact that they have won big games. The argument against it would be, since his first year where they appeared in the national championship game, they're 4 games over 500 in league play. They're 26-22 in the last 6 years in the SEC. They've won 20 SEC games in the last 4 years. But you put his team in a big spot, and they can deliver. So that's I'm good with that. But it's going to be another. I mean, every year's a hot seat year, right? So who knows what this looks like in a year?
I also think this guy, like Jimbo and like Dan Mullen, he has a specific role. He's an offensive quote-unquote guru.
You know what's funny?
And like Dan Mullen, he has – I give you credit, and we'll get into Lane a little bit later, when you are – and now we could argue like him and Sark kind of splitted duties back in the day at SC. He was the offensive coordinator for Cam Newton's national championship, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was the OC. He was the mind behind that.
Right. Just like you give Mullen credit at Florida, you give Mullen was he was the quarterback coach for Alex Smith. I also, tell me, am I crazy for giving Malzahn some credit for going to multiple state title games at 3 different high schools, and he won multiple state titles at 2 different high schools? I actually wrote that down. I was like, you know what? We're just talking about, can you coach? And there are so many great high school coaches out there. 3 different schools, multiple state title appearances at 3 different schools. So I had to give him a little – that doesn't really factor in at the end of the day because all these resumes have so much other stuff on them, but I had to give him some love for that.
Think about this guy. In his time coaching at Auburn, as an assistant, as the offensive coordinator, and that team was led by Cam, right? That team was a Cam run operation. And then as a head coach, he's won the SEC West twice during peak Saban. And as an offensive coordinator, he was part of the team that also beat him. So he's been a part of 3 SEC West champs of the last decade.
Pretty good.
Of Saban's, like, John Wooden's run.
Right.
Yeah. So I
like it.
And you would say this, wouldn't you? If he gets, like, you wouldn't just, Gus Malzahn playing Jimbo, playing Ed, playing Kirby, just in a big game. Like, he can hang. He might beat him that week.
Yeah. All right, let's get on. I put 7 and 8 up together, John, Mike Leach and Mike Stoops, because we went back and forth on Mark Stoops, Mike Leach and Mark Stoops. We went back and forth on these two. For me, I have Leach ahead of Stoops. We agree. This is why. Now, it's his first year in the league, and obviously that's a major question mark. I think he's a good fit at Mississippi State, but he won one of the National Coach of the Year awards in 2018. His offense has been number 1 in the country for the last 6 years in passing. When we talk about relative to your own program, where do you rank? He's one of the winningest coaches in Washington State history. He is the winningest coach in Texas Tech football history. In his 10 years there, he won 84 games. And then when I say to you, who were during Mike Leach's time at Washington State, who were consistently the best coaches in that league, I think you'd say David Shaw. You'd say Chris Peterson.
During that time, he's turning down NFL jobs, right? When he was humming.
Chris Peterson. And then I'll throw the USC program in. Only Chris Peterson from 2015, 16, 17, 18, that 4-year stretch, only Chris Peterson won more games than Mike Leach in the Pac-12 in league games. He won the same number of league games as David Shaw. He won the same number of league games as USC football did in that 4-year stretch. So
you could play that same game at Texas Tech in the Big 12 with
he
was his brother and with Mac Brown when he was good.
He was the Big 12 Coach of the Year, twice the Pac-12 Coach of the Year. So it was. This is tight, though. This is tight with him and Mark Stoops because Stoops' resume at Kentucky is really good.
You can't argue that Leach's resume is better than Stoops. I think Leach is the biggest unknown, and we've all been asking this forever. How would he do in the SEC against those defenses with that speed? Buckle up. We're about to find out.
You're right. The counter is couldn't beat Washington. The offense just, when it got to those type of games, couldn't win because they don't run the football. But, yeah, here we go.
We're about to find out. I think what Mark Stoops has done these last 2 years to win 10 games and that year have a top 10 draft pick who's a dynamic pass rusher, multiple NFL guys, and then to come back and win 8 games at Kentucky, that's basketball 101 right there. It's not just the biggest basketball school in the conference. It's the biggest basketball school in the country. You could make the argument Duke, North Carolina, but it's like I'm taking when I think college basketball, the first program that comes to my mind is Kentucky, and he hasn't just won there. And even I've heard Calipari talk how much pride he gets because he goes football when they win it economically it has a bigger impact even and we're what is Rupp Arena holds like one of the biggest arenas in the country right? It's like 24,000 people. It's massive. But football has been big for, I just think, their program. Stoops is sometimes when you just talk to Stoops' brother, because Bob is just kind of a rock star. He's the most famous brother by far. I underrated this guy for a long period of time. I think he's been really, really impressive these last couple of years. And clearly, to win at a basketball school in a football conference, it's hard to be much more impressed. Like this guy easily, and I'm sure whether it's countless programs probably that never got out have sniffed around on this guy to go to run a quote unquote football school. And maybe he just likes it. It's the SEC. The SEC East, the counter would be the SEC East. Been a little shittier, right?
Well,
beside Georgia.
But it's not like this is a 2-year stretch, right? This is a seven-year stretch where he, for the first 6 years, for the first 6 years, he never won fewer games than he did the year before. So he kept at least even or up, just taking steady steps. He wins 10 games, like you said, the first double-digit winning season since 1978. And I think this is such a big way to evaluate coaches. Your high is one thing, but what's your kind of just your okay? To win 10 games, have a historic season for Kentucky, lose players, and then come back and win 8? Give him a lot of credit. Top 15 defense in the nation the last 2 years.
I really think I give you so much credit at a basketball school if you make a name for yourself as a football coach in a football conference. And the ACC historically was really good when Florida and Florida State was there. I think Cutcliffe kind of did that at Duke. And you just hear Coach K, the way they talk about him. And I think Stoops is doing that a lot right here at Kentucky. I think it's why when it's happened a little bit at North Carolina, like when Fedora had the one, you get a lot of extra credit for that. Like you're LSU, Alabama, no excuse. Like sometimes you go 6-6 at a basketball school. It's like, well, we're in the Final Four. All is good, right? But to me, he's thrown his hat in the ring. No, we're not just going 500. We're winning. If you have a double-digit win season, I don't care how down the SEC East is. That season 2 years ago is just you don't see that very often.
No. How about the guy that can make the biggest jump? Because we thought about we were debated could this guy be a little higher. In the end, Lane Kiffin,
Joey Freshwater,
number 7. Number 9.
I think this guy has the biggest upside to be a Kirby, Dan Mullen type, the way we talk about him in several years. But when you look at his head coaching resume, he did take over. He went 7-6, right, his first year at Tennessee. Then he jumped. Now he jumped to a program that then got sanctioned. I think we have to red flag.
And he won 10 games the second year at SC.
We have to red flag that situation a little bit, but it did not go well. We both watched that very closely. His offense was atrocious. He was the play caller. Remember, his dad was part of the program. Eddie O was part of the program. It just did not work. But I do think and a big reason he's even admitted this, like Saban changed his career. And I actually think the last 3 years, winning that conference twice at kind of a smaller school when no one's paying attention, his games are on channels that no one's watching. I think he kind of proved to himself that he can be a head coach. And you watch that intro press conference in the basketball arena at Ole Miss. He does feel like a different human than the guy that we watched at SC. I'd even say that the coordinator for Nick, I think the last several years in Boca Raton, that place I've never been there. I want to get. It looks sweet. He was always like fishing on the ocean. I think you're getting a mature Lane Kiffin guy. We know he can recruit, and we know that he's adaptable offensively. Remember Nick they used to butt heads because I think Lane was kind of progressive, and Nick, I actually think he helped Nick be a little more open-minded offensively. And Nick a little more keep it in the 90s, run. He wanted to pass, run, pass.
Maybe because Lane was already Lane before he got to Saban. You know, I give him a lot of credit. His head coaching career since Saban, he acts like Lane, right?
Yeah.
He acts like Lane. He's not trying to be Nick, and I think that's for anybody that works for somebody great, I think that's hard. But Lane kind of knew who he was to begin with. 4 winning seasons in the history of FAU. It's only been around 16 years. Lane has 2 of them. And again, 11 wins, 5 wins. Okay, pressure's on. What now? 11 wins again.
So. Well, yeah, and I would say that is the knock on some of the Kirbys, the Pruitts. They're just trying to be like Nick 2.0, kind of like Belichickians, right? All the guys that leave Belichick, they try to act like Bill. You're right. Lane is very comfortable in his own skin just being Lane Kiffin. Great Twitter follow as well.
Shockingly, the only member of the Bald Brotherhood comes in at number 10, Jeremy Pruitt. Kind of looks like Bill O'Brien a little. Looks like he could be a member of the O'Brien family. I wanted to have him higher, John. This is not 10 for Pruitt because I don't believe in Pruitt. I mean, you think about the way last year started. It looked like a disaster. They went 5-3 in the SEC. His defense went from the bottom of the SEC to the middle of the SEC. And
former high school coach, Hoover High.
Hoover High?
Yeah. The ESPN, I remember in the 2000s used to have a reality show with that program.
So, like, you know what this is one of the more interesting games. Tennessee plays at Oklahoma on September 12th this year. But, yeah, man, like, this is Jeremy Pruitt 10, and I feel okay about him. I feel good about him at Tennessee. How would you characterize him at 10 for you?
Well, I would say in the short term, like his team should be better than Lane and Mike Leach's team next year, right? Like if you told me that Tennessee wins 8 or 9 games, I can believe that. Now, my question is, can he sustain winning 9 games every year? / can he ever put them in position where he's going to the SEC championship game, winning his division? I don't know. You're right. His tenure got off to a rocky start. Remember how he got there, right? It went to Greg Schiano, right, which the greatest, and I was in full support. Greg Schiano couldn't have coached at Tennessee. Now, they then tried to go to Mike Leach. Everyone freaked out. AD got fired. They ended up with him, who belongs in the SEC. Like, he's an SEC coach, Saban's guy. The high end. I don't know.
I understand, but
I believe Lane, Stoops, Leach, all these guys, the high end's higher. Now, this guy, one thing I think you have to feel good at if you're Tennessee, my program's not going to be a joke anymore. No more Derek Dooley. No more Butch Jones. Like, I do think this guy can just be a credible coach. Now, they might get to a position in 2 or 3 years. We need a guy to get us over the next hump. That's my question mark on Jeremy Pruitt.
Look, you don't give somebody credit for losing to Georgia State and BYU to open a season, but I thought you do give somebody credit for every coach is going to have to deal with adversity in one way or another. Theirs looked like a disaster. Don't forget, it's not. Then they beat Chattanooga. Then they had to play Florida and Georgia after that. So by October 5th, John, they were 1-4.
I got
and then only lost 1 game the rest of the way.
2 jobs for you in the country that are underrated hard because of the ghost / the actual human in Philip Fulmer and Barry Alvarez are still a huge
Wisconsin.
part of the program.
I knew you were gonna say
They're
that.
always around.
It's true.
And it's just like, oh, there's Philip Fulmer, the guy we won the Natty with, the sweet guy. There's Barry Alvarez. Like,
John,
geez, leave these guys alone.
One more. How about when Spurrier walks in and jumps on the whiteboard with Mullen?
Well, to me, though, he's won enough. It's a little easier. I think it's much harder, especially for Pruitt. At least Chris in Wisconsin is a Wisconsin guy. So that's
Spurrier's
his guy.
not the AD.
Yeah, he's just bored.
All right.
Fulmer, do you think Phillips like sending some plays or some ideas? For sure.
Next up, John, this is another area where we had some conversations. Number 11, I think this will surprise some people. Eli Drinkwitz, Missouri. He has been a head coach for 1 year at App State, and he followed Scott Satterfield, who had a lot of success at App State. So you could argue we don't really even know what he is as a head coach because, I don't know, was that team set up to just win a bunch of games again? But he did win the games. This is why I think he belongs at 11 ahead of Muschamp. He beat Muschamp last year. He went 13-1. He beat North Carolina too, but he beat Muschamp. So, you know, I would say now, would you agree now we're to the part of the list where we're kind of splitting hairs? You could argue he shouldn't be ahead of Muschamp or Mason just because he hasn't coached in the SEC before, but
very tough place to win. That's, you know, ever
Missouri.
Since they've transitioned, when they transition into the SEC, it's a very, very difficult job, especially if some of those teams, if Florida kind of gets back on track, which they are, Tennessee starts winning 8-9 games. You got Kentucky playing well. It's going to be hard to win 4 games in conference play every year.
And some people, if you're yelling at the YouTube right now, you could easily put them. You could put them 14. I mean, there's just a lot of unknown, right?
This guy has proven as a head coach that he can win a little, though, right? Now I think the counter would be, well, he took over Appalachian State, which was humming,
and it was 1 year, it wasn't 3 years, but yeah. So then we have Muschamp next. I mean, look, he beat Georgia last year.
He did.
But he lost to App State, lost to North Carolina.
How do you go 4-8 and beat Georgia? How is that possible?
I know.
How do you not have like a 6 or 7 win team? Because clearly when your guys try, and I get it, that you factor in kids are human even more than like NFL teams when you look at records. How could Georgia look at South Carolina and think they're their equals? There's no one at South Carolina. I mean, probably a small percentage of the guys at South Carolina, if they would have been offered by Georgia, they would have ended up at Georgia. But, Guy, if I was an athletic director, whether I'm in the SEC or anywhere, I just would not hire Will Muschamp to be my head coach. I just think that we've kind of seen it now for long enough. He's like a poor man's Kirby. His sideline, he's always out of control. His teams are he's just not a dynamic enough coach, for being a quote unquote Saban defensive guy. It just, I don't get it.
One note that I'll add, John, just from research, in the SEC era for South Carolina, starting in 1992, they've had 5 coaches. The only guy to win double-digit games is Spurrier. He did it 3 times, won 11 games. Only one. So do with that what you will.
They went through a historic recruiting time, and Spurrier got them all, right? Clowneys, Alshons, Gilmores. Like, he was getting elite players. Yeah, he was getting elite players. They were from his home state. And just Spurrier as a coach is in a different stratosphere than Muschamp.
Last two, Derek Mason, Sam Pittman. Again, for me, Mason last year, they have that Missouri game. They upset Missouri. He does this awesome, just loved it. This interview he does on the field, fired up. They have a bye, and then they go lose 24-7 to South Carolina the next year. He took over a program that John – and look, the argument for him would be, look, Vandy started playing football the year before the World Series existed, 1902. They've never had a 10-win season. James Franklin
in the history of the program.
James Franklin won 9 games twice and got on the Learjet as fast as he could.
Yeah.
So
very tough place.
Extremely tough. But he did. Derek Mason takes over with some program momentum, back-to-back 9-win seasons, and 2 bowl games in the last 6 years.
Yeah, I think when you take a step back, Derek Mason probably struggled to win games this year and will be out of the league. I think James Franklin will be viewed as just an all-time outlier for that program.
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to compare yourself to him.
Like I actually don't think that you can look at Derek Mason as some scrub coach for losing there.
No, I agree with you.
I give Muschamp more heat, and I don't expect Muschamp, like you said, the Spurriers winning the double-digit games. I'm not expecting South Carolina to do that. But if you're a good coach, you win 7, not 4.
I would have considered making the argument that they should be flip-flopped. But, it's hard when Vandy just came off a bye after a big win and lost 24-7 to South Carolina last year.
You can never say never, but if Muschamp loses his job, South Carolina, let's say after the 2020 season, he has another under 500 year. Is he ever a Power 5 head coach again? He's had multiple shots now.
Power 5? Probably not.
No.
Sam Pittman, again, 14, hasn't been the head coach in almost 20 years. 2 years as a JC head coach. Tough job. 19 straight SEC losses at Arkansas. This thing blows my mind. If you count – now, they've had 4 head coaches in the last decade, Middlecoff. But if you count interims, and I'm just going to assume that, like, when Paul Rhodes was the interim between Bielema and Chad Morris, that I got to assume they put him in the head coach's office for a few minutes. Like, he got to sit in that chair. So if we just say number of guys that have had the head coach's office in the last 10 years, it's 7. 7 different guys have at one point or another just head coach here. 7. So I do.
How many years? 7 and how many years you say?
10, counting interims and just like right. So I do think Sam Pittman's going to bring some stability. He's going to recruit offensive linemen. He knows what it takes, how to play there with Bielema. So I mean, I don't think I think he at least will put a stop to this revolving door that's been Arkansas's head coach for a few years.
You were telling me before we started recording that he was one of Kirby's best recruiters while he was at Georgia.
Yeah.
He was the offensive line coach for Bielema, so he has experience. And Bielema is actually, his resume looks a little bit better at Arkansas than I think people, like the last couple of years, you kind of realize your program's just not that good. I watched an interview with this guy when he got hired with Feinbaum. He's got some personality, Southern guy, big chubby, kind of happy-go-lucky, who offensive line coach, so you know he's a grinder. It's just, to me, programs, it's just very, very hard to win. You know, it really is. And I think sometimes, like Bielema was a star coming in. The problem for Arkansas is this guy's not going to be the flashiest or sexiest, and the Mississippi schools are going to get just a lot of pub because of those two guys. Yeah. So sometimes when you had a program like Arkansas that gets Petrino or Bielema that gets that level pub, when Mississippi or Mississippi State's down, I think with Lane and Leach, they're going to steal a lot from these bottom 3 or 4 programs. Just all else fails, just talk Lane or Leach.
All right, let us know in the comments where we're wrong, John. Don't just yell at the screen. Tell us type it to our faces, and we'll consider maybe.
I love the SEC.